Before we begin, I want you to do something simple that has become an essential part of these documented accounts. Leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact time your clock shows at this moment. Not roughly, the exact minute. We keep track of when and where these stories surface because sometimes there are patterns. Patterns in geography, patterns in timing, and patterns in how certain histories choose their moments to reappear. Fix your place and your time, and then we'll fix another. The year was 1874. In a stretch of countryside where the red clay roads wound through low hills and the air carried the heavy scent of pine, wet earth, and chimney smoke from scattered homesteads. On the outskirts of a growing settlement, one that would decades later be absorbed into a larger township, stood a house that seemed almost too ordinary to warrant the kind of fear it would eventually inspire. White clapboard siding, a modest porch, and a sharply pitched roof that made the attic unusually tall for a home built in that period. It belonged to the Wilkins family, and to those who passed by in carriages or on foot along the dusty road, it looked like nothing more than a typical home of the post-reconstruction South. But behind the facade of neat symmetry and domestic pride was a single door. Small, wooden, and unremarkable, the family would lock it and keep it locked for nearly half a century. The attic? The Wilkins family had moved into the home just after the spring planting season of 1873. The patriarch, a polite but distant man, had recently inherited funds that allowed him to purchase land and settle beyond the crowded central districts. His wife, described in later records as quiet and dutiful, seemed relieved to be somewhere calmer, somewhere away from the noise and tension that had permeated the rebuilding years. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, each young enough that the rural life suited them. The neighbors recalled the eldest son running through the fields with a wooden hoop, the middle child constantly asking questions of anyone who would answer, and the daughter trailing her mother like a small shadow. They were, by all accounts, an unremarkable family in an unremarkable home. But what happened in the spring of 1874 would change the way the Wilkins viewed every room in their house, particularly the one above them. According to the earliest surviving documents connected to the case, the first indication that something was wrong came not from a dramatic event or a supernatural disturbance, but from sounds. Sounds that, at first, could be explained away. In a statement collected many years later, the second Wilkins son described it as a tapping, like someone running a finger along the inside of the wall. He would have been around 8 years old at the time, though the recollection was made more than 60 years later. On windy nights, when the pine trees swayed and the rafters creaked, the tapping blended easily into the house's natural rhythms. Houses talked, as people in rural communities often said. Wood shifted, nails loosened, animals nested in rafters. None of it was unusual. But then the tapping changed. According to a journal kept by the children's mother, a journal that surfaced decades later in the possession of a distant relative, the noises began forming patterns. Not random scurrying or settling. Patterns. Always in the same section of ceiling. Always at night, after the household had gone quiet. The mother wrote that she had mentioned it to her husband on several occasions, but he dismissed the concern. He attributed it to animals or the wind or the children's imaginations. But the mother did not share his certainty. "It is too regular," she wrote, "too deliberate." The first major event occurred on April 12, 1874. The date appears repeatedly in the surviving documents, in the mother's journal, in a later deposition by a farmhand, and in the recollection of the eldest child many decades afterward. Late that evening, after the children had gone to bed and the house had settled into its usual nighttime stillness, a single sharp sound echoed through the upper floor. The mother described it as a knock, not a tap, a knock, loud enough to wake the youngest from his sleep. The father finally agreed to investigate the attic. He took a lantern, opened the narrow attic staircase door, and ascended. What he found or did not find was never fully clarified, even in his own writings. But the family noticed that when he came back down, He was pale, quiet, and unwilling to speak of what he had seen. The only detail he ever provided, recorded by his wife that same night, was this: "There is something wrong with the boards." That was all he said. Something is wrong with the boards. He nailed the attic door shut the next morning. But that was only the beginning. Over the next several days, the noises not only continued but also intensified. Neighbors reported seeing the Wilkins lamps burning late into the night. One farmhand who occasionally worked for them recalled hearing what he described as soft shifting sounds, like cloth dragged over wood. The Wilkins tried to go about their daily routines, but the atmosphere inside the house had changed. The mother noted in her journal that the children grew restless, the youngest refusing to sleep alone. The father worked longer hours outside, returning only when necessary. On April 19th, 1 week after the first knock, the eldest Wilkins child claimed he heard something moving above him during the daytime. That detail frightened the mother more than any nighttime disturbances. Sounds at night could be explained, but daylight? That implied someone active, awake. Then came the incident that forced the family to lock the attic door permanently. It was April 22nd, recorded by multiple sources. The mother had been sweeping the upstairs hallway when she noticed a thin line of dust falling from the ceiling, drifting gently down as if disturbed by movement above. She froze and listened. And for the first time, according to her diary, she heard it clearly. Footsteps, slow, measured, directly above her. She backed away, her heart pounding, and called for her husband. When he arrived and heard the same unmistakable sound, he made his decision. The attic would be sealed. Not temporarily, not until pests were cleared, permanently. That evening, after the children were asleep, he installed a heavy iron lock on the attic door. He hammered long nails along the edges of the frame. He instructed the family never to enter the attic again, no matter what they heard. And then he made a curious and unsettling remark, recorded in the mother's journal. "Whatever is up there wants us to open the door. We will not." What exactly he meant by that statement and what he believed was "up there" remains unclear. No document records his explanation, but from that night on, the attic remained locked. For decades, for 3 nights after the lock was installed, the house grew strangely quiet. The mother wrote that she felt a sense of temporary relief, a lifting of some invisible pressure that had been hanging over the upper floor. The children slept more peacefully, or at least more deeply. The father stopped pacing the length of the downstairs hall after sundown. Even the farm animals, usually restless during storms or periods of high humidity, seemed unusually calm. It was as if sealing the attic had confined not only the sounds but also the atmosphere that came with them. But in these historical cases that involve spaces deliberately sealed, places left untouched for years, and quiet are rarely a blessing. More often, it is the breath before something reveals itself. According to the mother's journal entry dated April 26th, the silence broke, not with footsteps or tapping, but with a single, soft exhale, a sigh that seemed to drift through the keyhole of the locked attic door. "Not loud," she wrote. "Barely a breath, but close, too close, as if someone had placed their mouth to the other side of the door." She did not tell her husband at first. She feared he might think her imagination had finally gotten the better of her. But 2 nights later, he heard it too. Sometime after midnight, while sitting at the kitchen table reviewing ledger notes, he froze. His wife, who had been boiling water for tea on the iron stove, watched him lean his head toward the staircase. Then he whispered, "There it is again." They both heard it. Not a sigh this time, but the faint sound of something or someone pressing against the attic door. A subtle shift of wood, a gentle tension in the hinges. Not enough to open it, just enough to suggest the door was being tested. The father retrieved the lantern and the rifle he kept by the back door. He went to the second floor. He knelt beside the attic door, and after a long silence, he called out, "Who's there?" Nothing. Only the sound of his own breath. After a moment, he whispered something the mother wrote down later. It's waiting. The next morning, he hammered additional nails into the door frame. He strung a metal chain across the door and secured it to the wall with 2 iron bolts. Then he told the family that under no circumstances was anyone to approach that door again. But the house was not finished. A week passed with no further disturbances. The family resumed the rhythms of rural life. There were chores to be done, livestock to tend, and crops in need of attention. The children played in the yard again, and the parents tried in small ways to reclaim a sense of normalcy. Yet the mother continued to write. Her journal entries never relaxed. She remained certain that something, some presence, lingered above them. Her language grew more fragmented, as if she were trying to articulate something she feared was too irrational to name. On May 4th, she wrote, "There is a feeling in the house, like a weight in the air, as if someone is listening from the other side of the ceiling, listening to every word." That same week, the youngest child refused to sleep in his bedroom. He insisted he heard whispering through the ceiling boards, though he could not make out the words. "Like someone talking in another room," he said. When asked to describe the voice, he told his mother, "It sounds like dry leaves rubbing together." The father moved the youngest into the downstairs parlor temporarily. The mother later wrote that she believed the father was losing sleep. She often found him awake in the middle of the night, sitting by the dying embers of the fireplace, staring toward the upstairs, landing as if expecting something to descend. On May 11th, something finally happened that forced the family to acknowledge the attic was not simply a problem of sound or imagination. It was something physical, something that could move objects, something that could reach beyond the sealed door. That morning, the eldest son discovered a thin line of black dust across the hallway floor outside the attic entrance. Not soot, not soil, something finer, almost powder-like. The father examined it and noted the odd smell, metallic, faintly bitter. More troubling was the pattern. The dust did not fall randomly. It formed a distinctly straight line from the base of the attic door to the top of the stairs, as if something had dragged across the threshold. The father cleaned it immediately and said nothing to the children. But later that afternoon, the mother found the same dust beneath her pillow. No footprints, no disturbance in the bedding, just the dark line of powder, thin and deliberate, as if placed by hand. She did not sleep that night. Over the next several days, small objects began to disappear from the bedrooms: hairpins, buttons, scraps of paper, and a wooden toy horse. They would reappear in strange arrangements near the base of the attic door, as if returned, as if catalogued. On May 18th, the father gathered the family in the kitchen and made a decisive announcement. They would be sealing the attic door completely, not with a lock, not with a chain, with wood, with nails, with plaster, with anything that would make it impossible for the door to open again. But before he could begin the work, something happened that remains one of the most chilling details in the early accounts of the Wilkins house. The daughter, only 6 years old at the time, came downstairs holding something in her hand, something she said she found in the attic hallway. It was a scrap of yellowed paper. On it, written in charcoal, were 3 words: "Please let me out." The father ripped the paper from her hand, burned it in the stove, and ordered the children outside. That very evening, he began the full sealing of the attic door. He boarded it from top to bottom, covered the boards with plaster, painted over it so that no seam remained. And by nightfall, the attic entrance was invisible. That would have been the end of it. It should have been the end had the house stayed silent. But on May 21st, 3 days after the door was sealed, the mother wrote a final chilling entry in her journal. "The door is gone, but the sounds are not. Tonight, I heard footsteps, but they were not above us. They were in the walls." For most families, sealing a door, erasing it completely, is an act of desperation so profound that it becomes a kind of private ritual, a pact made between fear and survival. For the Wilkins family, it was not enough, because whatever moved in that attic did not require a door. It required only space, and the house had plenty of that. According to the mother's surviving journal, its pages brittle and ink faded. The days following the sealing of the attic were marked by a strange oscillation between oppressive silence and sudden, inexplicable noises. The family would go whole mornings without hearing anything unusual. Birds in the pines outside sang. The livestock moved in predictable rhythms. The children played, though with a caution that belied their age. But then, without warning, a sound. A shift inside the walls, a low creak traveling across the ceiling beams, or a whisper of displaced air would break the illusion of calm. On May 26th, the father noticed something odd near the base of the staircase. A faint indentation in the plaster wall. Small, oval, almost like the impression of knuckles pressing from the inside. He ran his hand over the surface. It was warm. He said nothing to the family. That night, the house woke them all. According to later accounts, a loud, resonant thud shook the upper floor shortly after midnight. The children screamed. The mother rushed to them, gathering them in her arms, while the father climbed the stairs alone, lantern trembling in his hand. He expected to find fallen beams, perhaps part of the roof collapsing. But the ceilings were intact. The attic, now sealed so completely it was indistinguishable from the rest of the hallway, showed no signs of disturbance. Yet something had struck the upper floor. Something heavy enough to rattle the dishes in the cupboard below. When the father pressed his ear against the now plastered wall, he heard a faint scraping, slow and deliberate, moving downward. He stepped back. For a long moment he stood there in the dim light, the lantern casting long shadows across the corridor. Then he turned, descended the stairs, and told his wife to pack some belongings. They would leave the house for the night. They walked to a neighbor's property a quarter-mile down the road and slept in the barn, too ashamed or too frightened to explain why. The next morning, the father returned alone to the house. What he found made him sit down hard on the bottom step. In the hallway, directly opposite the erased attic door, someone had left a message in long vertical scratches on the wall plaster. The marks were rough, uneven, and carved with something blunt, but they formed unmistakable shapes. Letters, not a full sentence, just a name, or what seemed to be a name. A single word, illegible now in surviving photographs of the site. But on that morning, clearly understandable to the father, who stared at it for a long time before scraping the letters away with a knife. He never wrote down what the word was, but the mother's journal makes an unsettling note. He seemed to know it. This raised a question investigators would ponder many years later. Did the father recognize the name because it belonged to someone from his past? Or because it belonged to someone still inside the house? For the next several weeks, the family lived in a fragile routine. They slept lightly. They avoided the second floor when possible. The children began complaining of cold drafts in rooms with no open windows. The mother, exhausted, reported feeling watched whenever she passed the upper landing. The father, attempting to maintain order, spent much of his time outside or in his workshop until early June, when another discovery forced him to confront the attic again, at least mentally. On June 3rd, while cleaning the parlor, the mother found something tucked underneath the rug near the back door. A small wooden object, smooth, rectangular, and roughly carved. At first, she thought it was a child's discarded toy, but when she picked it up, she realized it was much older than anything in the household, a fragment of something larger. The edges were charred, as if burned long ago. Most disturbingly, the underside bore faint markings and scratches resembling tally marks. Dozens of them, groups of 5, long sequences, as if someone had used the wood to count days or years. She dropped it immediately. In the days that followed, the mother became increasingly fixated on the idea that something trapped, or something that had been trapped, was trying to communicate. The children, sensing their mother's unease, began asking questions the parents couldn't answer. But the father refused to entertain speculation. When the mother showed him the wooden fragment, he burned it in the stove without comment. But later that night, June 4th, he was seen by the neighbor's wife walking around the perimeter of the house, lantern in hand, eyes scanning the exterior walls. She watched him circle the house twice before he finally re-entered. She would later tell investigators, "It was like he expected something to step out of the wall itself." The most chilling event of that month occurred on June 11th. The middle child, the boy who had first heard the whispers, came running into the kitchen at dusk, trembling violently. His mother tried to calm him, but he grabbed her arm and pointed upstairs. "There's someone in the wall," he said. At first, she thought he meant an animal. But he insisted, voice shaking, that a hand had reached out from a crack near the baseboard and touched his foot. Touched, not brushed, not scratched. Touched. The father stormed up the stairs, tools in hand, and ripped away a section of baseboard where the boy indicated. Behind it lay a narrow gap, one of the many peculiar spaces common in older homes, too small for a person to stand in, but large enough for someone to crawl through if they were determined. But it was not the space that horrified him. It was what was inside. A length of cloth, rolled tightly. Old, stained. When he unrolled it, dust scattered onto the floor. Inside the cloth was a small item, a button made of bone. And wrapped beside it was an even smaller object, a metal pin engraved with a tiny emblem from a design no one in the family recognized. The mother began to cry. The father put his hand against the inner wall. It felt warm again. That night, he told the family they were leaving the house until further notice. They stayed with neighbors for over a month. When they finally returned in July, they found the house quieter. Still, but something felt wrong, as if the house had been waiting. On July 18th, according to documents later uncovered, the father made a drastic decision. He would open the sealed attic again, not to investigate alone, but to prove that nothing and no one was inside. He told his wife the family could not live in fear forever. He retrieved his tools. He stood before the plastered-over doorway, and as he lifted the first chisel, the mother heard it. 3 knocks. From the other side, what happened next would become the pivot point for every later investigation into the Wilkins house. Because in that moment, as the father froze with his chisel raised and the mother stood at the end of the hallway holding her breath, the house felt impossibly alive. It was as though every beam, every nail, every quiet space between the walls had been listening for that exact instant. The father lowered his tool slowly, knuckles whitening around the handle. 3 measured, evenly spaced knocks had come from behind a wall that, according to the family, concealed nothing but dust and darkness. His first instinct was to deny the sound. "Perhaps the wind," he said. "Perhaps a loose board somewhere else in the upper floor." But the mother shook her head. "It wasn't the wind," she whispered. "It was answering you." For nearly a full minute, the family stood motionless. No further sound followed. The father set the chisel aside, claiming he would reconsider opening the attic in the morning, but he didn't sleep that night, and neither did anyone else. The next day, the father walked into town and sought out the only professional who might understand the house's strange behavior: the county surveyor, a man familiar with structural anomalies in older buildings. This man, whose official report still exists, visited the Wilkins property on July 19, 1874. According to his notes, the house appeared stable. No signs of shifting beams, no pressure points that might cause phantom noises. Yet the second floor felt, in his words, unsettled, as though the air itself carried memory. The surveyor spent nearly 2 hours tapping along the walls, listening for hollow spaces. When he reached the area where the attic door had been plastered over, he paused. His report states he detected a pocket of space inconsistent with the plans of the original structure. When he asked the father what had existed there before the ceiling, the father claimed only that the attic was damaged last year and closed off for safety. But the surveyor, unconvinced, pressed his palm against the plaster. Then he stepped back. "It's warm," he said. "Why is it warm?" The father didn't answer. Before leaving, the surveyor offered a final remark that would be quoted decades later. "If someone or something were inside that space, you'd hear more than knocks." 3 days later, they heard something else entirely. On the night of July 22nd, with summer storms gathering outside, The family sat in the parlor, listening to distant thunder. At around 9 p.m., the eldest daughter noticed the chandelier above them, swaying gently, though no wind reached the room. The mother hushed the children, listening. Then the sound came. A low, rhythmic dragging moving across the attic floorboards directly overhead. The father stood up abruptly, but the mother grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said. "Not tonight." But the sound continued, slow and methodical, as though someone was pulling something heavy from one side of the attic to the other. The dragging lasted nearly 30 seconds, then ceased. A moment later, a loud thud shook dust from the ceiling. The children screamed. The family left the house again, staying with neighbors until morning. When daylight came and the father returned to inspect the attic from the outside, he found no signs of intrusion, but the gutters along the roofline were filled with debris, not leaves or twigs, but torn scraps of cloth, all of them sun-bleached and brittle. The pieces appeared to have been pushed up from inside, as though something had tried and failed to force its way through the roof. The father burned the scraps in the yard. The mother watched from the porch, unable to shake the feeling that the house was no longer simply hiding something, it was remembering something. The next entry in her journal, dated July 23rd, reads, "There is something unfinished in this house. Something that won't let itself be forgotten." In the days that followed, the family reported no more knocks or dragging sounds. The house fell into a deceptive stillness, a quiet so deep that even the youngest child remarked, "It feels like the house is thinking," but calm only lasted a week. On the morning of July 30th, while sweeping the second-floor hallway, the mother discovered a new crack in the plaster just above the baseboard. Not a normal fissure from settling. This one curved downward, almost like the outline of a door frame. She leaned closer, and she saw something that made her drop the broom. Inside the crack, barely visible but unmistakably present, was a sliver of fabric. A fragment of material was wedged tightly into the wall, as if something had caught its clothing while trying to push through. The fabric was not from any garment in the home. It was older, coarser, and smelled faintly of smoke when the father pried it free. Later structural examinations would confirm that the crack did not align with any known internal cavity of the house. It should not have been possible for any fabric, burnt or otherwise, to be inside that wall. That same night, a storm rolled in. Heavy rain battered the roof. Thunder rattled dishes in the cupboards. At around 11 p.m., lightning struck a tree near the property, illuminating the house in quick, violent flashes. In one of those flashes, the middle child screamed. He insisted he saw a silhouette in the upstairs hallway, a figure standing where the attic door once was, still as stone. The father ran upstairs, but found nothing. The hallway was empty, but the air was cold. Too cold for summer. In the journal, the mother wrote, "He said it was a man, but not moving like a man, as though he were listening, waiting." At this point, the father's skepticism began to erode. He started carrying his tools everywhere. The neighbors saw him pacing the yard in the evenings, looking up at the windows as though expecting someone to appear in them. And then came August 2nd, the day everything changed. Because on that day, for reasons no one has ever fully explained, not in reports, not in diaries, not in testimonies, the sealed attic wall cracked open on its own. Not broken, not smashed, not pried, cracked. A long vertical split from ceiling to floor, clean and deliberate, like the house itself had exhaled. Inside the dark seam, something glinted. A nail, a piece of metal, or perhaps, as the mother later insisted, something like an eye catching the light. The father stepped closer, and before he could touch the wall, a voice soft, low, and unmistakably human spoke from behind it. Just one word, a word so simple, so ordinary, that it made the hair on the back of his neck rise. He would later refuse to repeat it. The father did not sleep the night he heard the voice in the wall. According to later testimony gathered from neighbors and distant relatives, he sat in the parlor chair for hours, lantern extinguished, staring toward the staircase, as though expecting someone or something to descend it. The house was silent again. Completely silent, and that silence only magnified what he had heard. A word. A single, ordinary word spoken in a tone that carried neither anger nor desperation, but something worse. Familiarity. He refused to repeat it to his wife. She asked him 3 times that evening, each time more shaken than the last, but he only shook his head. "It wasn't a stranger," he finally whispered. "That's all I can say." The next morning he attempted to resume normal life, though the tremor in his hands betrayed him. He nailed a heavy cabinet in front of the cracked section of wall. It made his wife feel slightly safer, but she knew the gesture meant nothing. It was like setting a chair against a door in a dream, symbolic protection against something intangible. For 2 days the house remained quiet. No dragging, no knocks, no cold drafts rolling across the upper landing. The children relaxed enough to play outside again. The mother tried to convince herself that whatever had awakened in the sealed space was retreating. But on August 4th, an event occurred that destroyed any hope of returning to normalcy. It began in the early evening, just as the light began to turn amber and the first cicadas began to hum. The youngest child, barely old enough to form full sentences, wandered into the kitchen carrying something in his small hands. At first the mother thought he had found a doll or a trinket buried in the yard. Then she realized he was holding a piece of wood. A square fragment, old and splintered, its edges darkened by what appeared to be soot. "Where did you find that?" she asked gently. The boy pointed upstairs. He did not have the vocabulary to describe exactly where, but when she pressed, he said, "The space, the small space." Her breath caught. She followed him to the staircase, heart pounding. He led her halfway up, then to the right, toward the cabinet the father had placed in front of the cracked wall. The cabinet, solid oak and weighing more than any family member could easily move, was no longer flush against the plaster. It had shifted nearly a foot. The mother stared at the gap behind it. The family had not touched it. It had moved on its own, or it had been moved. When she stepped closer, she saw that the crack in the wall had widened. The plaster had bulged outward slightly, as though under pressure from the inside. A faint smell drifted from the seam, an odor like burnt fabric mixed with damp soil. She hurried the child downstairs and waited for the father to return from the fields. When he arrived and saw the cabinet displaced, his face drained of color. He tried to lift it back into place, but his hands shook violently. Eventually he managed to drag it, wedging it once again in front of the crack, though both he and his wife knew it was useless. Something was testing the boundaries of the house, something that did not fear walls. That night, the father stayed awake, sitting in the hallway outside the children's rooms, with an oil lamp beside him and a hammer in his lap. Shortly after midnight, the house answered him. There came a faint tapping from behind the wall. Not knocking this time, a sound more delicate, more intentional. Tap, a pause. Tap, tap. Another pause. Tap. The father leaned forward, listening. The pattern repeated. 5 taps, in a sequence. Then silence. The mother emerged from the bedroom, trembling. "Is it trying to say something?" she whispered. The father didn't answer. Instead, he lifted the lamp and approached the cabinet again. The tapping resumed faster now, as though responding to his movement. Tap, 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 tap. The sequence did not resemble any code he knew, but the urgency was unmistakable. He stood directly before the cabinet, hand hovering over the smooth grain. From the other side of the wall came a sound as quiet as breathing, a shifting of weight, a subtle exhale. He stepped back. The mother pulled him away, insisting he leave it alone. But curiosity and dread warred in his face. The tapping continued intermittently for the next hour, then stopped abruptly around 2 in the morning. The house settled into silence once more. The next day, the father went into town to speak with a local carpenter, a man known for his work on older homes and more privately for his superstitions. The carpenter listened carefully as the father described the shifting walls, the tapping, and the crack. The carpenter's expression hardened. Something wasn't sealed right, he said. Or something shouldn't have been sealed at all. The father pressed him further, asking if he knew any history of the property before the Wilkins family arrived. The carpenter hesitated. Then he revealed something that had not appeared in any of the public records. The house had been built partially on the foundation of an older structure, a structure that had burned in the early 1860s under circumstances no one discussed openly. Some say there were rooms beneath it, the carpenter explained. Not cellars, rooms, hidden ones. Folks back then built spaces they didn't put on paper. The father left town without purchasing materials, disturbed by what he'd heard. When he returned home, he found his wife sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the wooden fragment their son had discovered. She had cleaned it. Beneath the soot, faint carvings appeared, lines, symbols, and one shallow indentation that looked unmistakably like the start of a letter or the beginning of a name. She placed her hand beside it. "It feels like it's part of something larger," she murmured, "like a piece of a message." As dusk fell, a heavy stillness settled over the house. The children slept fitfully. The mother kept a lantern burning low, and the father, unable to shake the carpenter's warning, paced the hallway outside the sealed attic wall. Shortly after midnight, he heard it again. Not knocking, not tapping, not dragging. A sound far more terrible. The unmistakable sound of someone placing their palm flat against the other side of the wall. Slow, firm, pressing, as though trying to feel the way through. And then an even softer sound, like the beginning of a word being whispered through plaster. He stepped back, heart pounding. For the first time, he believed the truth he'd been trying to deny. The house was not haunted. Something was alive in the walls, and it remembered him. In the days that followed the father's realization, the atmosphere in the Wilkins house shifted from fear to dread. Not the sharp, panicked dread of sudden danger, but a slow, suffocating kind that settles into the walls, into the air, into every quiet moment between breaths. The mother later wrote in her journal that the house felt charged, like the space itself was listening for their movements. Even the children sensed it. They spoke in whispers. They avoided the stairs entirely. The youngest refused to sleep unless a lantern remained lit. On August 7th, the father finally admitted openly what had been building inside him since the voice first spoke through the wall. At the kitchen table, hands clasped tightly around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold, he said, "I think something in that attic knows me." His wife looked at him, pale and exhausted. "Knows you? How?" He didn't answer. Perhaps he didn't know how to, but the truth was buried in the shadows of his past events he had never fully spoken about. Not to his wife, not to his children, not even to himself in the quiet places of his mind. And though he didn't say it aloud, something in the mother's expression revealed what she already suspected. It wasn't the first time the father had heard that voice. But before either of them could pursue the thought further, another event demanded their attention. That afternoon, while the father was outside gathering tools, the mother attempted to soothe the children by reading aloud from a book of parables. It was an ordinary moment, a rare attempt at calm within a house that no longer allowed it. Mid-sentence, she paused. The children looked at her. "Mama," one of them whispered. She didn't answer. She was staring at the staircase. A faint sound drifted down from the upper floor. Not knocking, not tapping, not even breathing. Humming, a soft, tuneless hum, as though someone was idly passing time just beyond the plastered-over attic entrance. The mother stood slowly, set the book down, and walked to the base of the stairs. The humming continued for several seconds, then stopped abruptly, as though interrupted by her presence. When the father returned moments later, she told him what she'd heard. He didn't doubt her. Not anymore. That evening, as storm clouds gathered again in the distance, the father took a lantern and ventured into the yard, circling the house with deliberate steps. Something had been gnawing at him since the carpenter mentioned the old foundation. If the attic was sealed incorrectly, or if walls had been built over previous walls, then the house might contain spaces he had never known about. spaces someone else might have known intimately. He inspected the external walls carefully, and then he saw it. On the north side of the house, near an overgrown cluster of blackberry bushes, a narrow horizontal line cut through the clapboard siding. Barely visible, weather-worn, but unmistakably purposeful. He crouched and touched it. The line was a seam of wood slats that didn't match the others. A sealed entryway, lower than the attic. Higher than the cellar. A forgotten room, or perhaps a room deliberately hidden. He stood up quickly, heart pounding. The discovery confirmed what the carpenter had hinted at. This house had layers. Layers built atop older layers, sealing histories no one wanted to confront. He ran back inside and told his wife. She grew pale. They decided to wait until morning to investigate, but the house didn't wait. That night, the wind picked up. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rolled across the fields, deep, long, and violent. Around 1 a.m., the father awoke to a strange coldness spreading through the bedroom floorboards. He slid out of bed and stepped into the hallway. The lantern he kept burning low was flickering wildly. Though there was no breeze, he lifted it. The flame steadied, but the temperature did not. It grew colder still as he ascended the staircase, each step creaking under his weight. On the landing, he paused. It was there again, the hum. Softer now, drawn out, wavering. But this time, it carried a rhythm, not a song, not speech, something in between, like someone trying to remember a melody they once knew. He raised the lantern toward the cabinet blocking the cracked wall. And then his breath caught. The cabinet was no longer flush against the wall. It had shifted even farther than before, nearly 2 feet outward, as though pushed from behind with deliberate force. The crack itself had widened. Fresh plaster dust lay scattered across the floorboards. He knelt beside the opening and hesitated. The humming stopped. A soft scraping sound replaced it. Something moving inside the wall, something dragging along wood. He forced himself to remain still. The scraping grew louder. Then it stopped directly behind the thin layer of plaster inches from his face. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a whisper so faint he wasn't sure he heard it at all breathed through the seam in the wall. Not a word. A sound. A syllable. The same tone he had heard the first time. Familiar. Intimate. And then, as lightning cracked outside, something struck the wall from the inside with such force that the lantern slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The house plunged into darkness. He stumbled backward, half falling down the stairs, as the children woke up screaming. His wife rushed from the bedroom, clutching their youngest, crying out his name. He gathered himself and ran to the cabinet. But all he could make out in the darkness was the outline of the shifted furniture and the faintest trace of warm air leaking from the widening crack. He lit a second lantern. When the flame steadied, he saw something wedged in the seam. A piece of paper, folded, yellowed with age. He reached for it. His wife grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said. He pulled it free anyway. The paper shook in his hand. It was brittle, stained, and had singed edges. He unfolded it carefully. There were only 3 words written inside, not a message of threat, not a cry for help, a name, his name. And underneath it, in smaller letters, barely legible through the smoke, marks one more word. Still here. He dropped the paper as though it was burning. The truth, unspoken all summer, finally breached the walls of denial. The thing in the attic wasn't haunting them. It wasn't trapped. It wasn't unknown. It was connected to him through history, memory, or blood. And whatever it wanted, it wasn't finished. The paper lay on the floor where the father had dropped it, its edges curling slightly in the heat of the lantern he'd relit. His wife stared at it with a kind of quiet horror, unable to bring herself to touch it. The children, now gathered in the hallway, clutching blankets, whispered questions he couldn't answer. He knelt slowly, hands trembling, and picked up the note once more. His name, written in a hand he hadn't seen in years. Or rather, had tried very hard not to see again. He did not tell his wife that. He did not say that the handwriting belonged to someone long thought gone from his life. Someone buried in past guilt. Someone he had imagined he'd never have to reckon with again. Instead, he folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket, unable to trust his voice. The crack in the wall pulsed faintly, as though the house itself were breathing. That was the moment the father decided something he had never dared articulate before. Whatever waited inside that sealed space was not a stranger. It was not an accident. And it had not come to the house by coincidence. It had come for him. The following morning, he rose before sunrise and walked to the small shed near the edge of the property where he kept old tools and scraps of lumber. He rummaged through boxes until he found a rusted metal lockbox he had not opened in years. Inside were personal items from his youth: letters, receipts, a faded photograph, and a ledger with entries that ended abruptly one winter nearly a decade earlier. He burned everything in the fire pit behind the shed, but he kept one item: a ring. Simple, worn, and etched with initials that were not his. He stared at it for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket beside the note. When he returned to the house, the morning sun barely cut through the heavy gray clouds. His wife stood at the window watching him approach, her face lined with worry. "We need help," she said when he entered. He agreed. But help was not easily found in a community where whispered superstitions carried as much weight as documented facts. The neighbors who housed them occasionally during restless nights were sympathetic but cautious. The surveyor had already given his opinion. The carpenter had offered only warnings. The sheriff, when approached later that week, dismissed their concerns as nerves, summer storms, and the imagination of children. But there was one person in town who did not dismiss them: the archivist. A woman responsible for preserving old land deeds, estate files, and records of properties predating the war. She had a reputation for knowing things others had forgotten or had chosen to forget. When the father visited her office, she listened with an expression of curious unease. She asked questions no one else had thought to ask. When was the house built? What stood on the property before it? What stories had been passed down, even informally, about the land? She disappeared into the back room of the archive for nearly an hour, emerging with a stack of brittle papers and a faint look of discomfort. "Your home," she said slowly, "is not the original structure." He already knew this much. But the archivist continued, "Nor is it built entirely over the same footprint as the previous building. Parts of the original foundation were incorporated into the new home. Rooms that no longer exist on any plan may still lie behind or beneath the walls." His breath caught. "Hidden rooms," she clarified. "Blocked up spaces, storage cavities. Chambers that aren't documented." She laid out an old property map between them, a map marked with rooms and corridors long since removed or sealed, including a narrow chamber that connected the old attic to a smaller room at the northern end of the home, the same side where the father had discovered the strange seam in the clapboard. "This," she said, tapping the map with a careful finger, "was called the interim room, a space used temporarily during construction or repairs. But I've never seen documentation showing it was decommissioned or removed. It's just absent from later drawings." He asked her what the room was used for. She hesitated. "There are rumors," she said quietly, "that the family who owned the property before you lost someone. A disappearance. A relative who was troubled. Some stories say he was last seen entering the house during a storm. Others claim the family kept him hidden and cared for him privately rather than sending him away." The father pressed her further. She shook her head. "Most of the records from that period are missing. But there's one detail I should tell you." She opened a small ledger and pointed to a note written in the margin in faded ink. "It says," she read aloud, "the one upstairs will not be moved again." The father felt a chill pass through him. When he left the archive, he did not walk straight home. He took the long route through the woods, the ring and the note heavy in his pocket. He needed time to confront what he had refused to face. Whoever or whatever was inside the walls might be connected to the earlier residents of the property. But the voice, the name, the handwriting, those belonged to someone else, someone from his life, someone he had wronged, or someone who believed he had. When he returned home hours later, dusk was settling. His wife met him at the door with a look that turned his stomach cold. "There's something you need to see," she said. She led him upstairs. The cabinet was no longer merely shifted. It had toppled onto its side, not broken, not forced, simply laid down gently, as if by careful hands. The crack in the wall had widened into a narrow opening, just wide enough for a hand to reach through, and someone had, because on the floor, directly beneath the opening, lay footprints, small, bare, coated in plaster dust. They stood in place for a moment before trailing down the hallway and stopping outside the door of the youngest child's room. The father's breath seized. "Where is she?" he whispered. His wife pointed to the bed. The child was sleeping, safe. But on the blanket beside her lay something new. A splinter of charred wood, with 5 tally marks carved into it. 5. As though someone in the walls was counting, and whatever they were counting was getting closer. The father stared at the tally-marked splinter of wood on his daughter's blanket, its charred surface catching the dim lantern light. 5 marks. 5 deliberate strokes. He lifted it with trembling fingers, turning it over slowly. The back of the fragment was worn smooth, as if held or handled for a long time. Too long. His wife stood frozen in the doorway, one hand pressed against her mouth, eyes wide with the kind of fear that leaves a permanent imprint on a person. The house was silent again, but it was a silence filled with intention. A waiting silence. The father slipped the wooden splinter into his pocket beside the ring and the folded note. He suddenly felt the weight of all 3 objects, as though they belonged together, pieces of a puzzle he had spent years refusing to assemble. He gently carried the sleeping child from the room to the downstairs parlor, where the family had begun spending most nights. He didn't tell his wife everything, not yet. But he did tell her something she had always suspected. "This isn't about this house," he whispered. "It never was. It's about something I did before we ever lived here." She didn't ask for details. Not then, not in that moment. Her silence said she already carried a shadow of the truth, even if she didn't know the shape of it. That night, the family slept in shifts. The mother dozed in a chair with the children clustered around her. The father sat by the window, lantern burning low, staring up the staircase as though expecting someone to descend. But the house did not stir. It offered no sound, no movement, no whispers. As dawn broke, filtered through the heavy summer clouds, he rose abruptly with a decision forming solidly in his mind. He would find the interim room. He could no longer wait for whatever lived behind the walls to come to them. The only way forward was through the old structure beneath the new, through the forgotten architecture that tied this house to histories buried twice over. He set out into the yard with his tools and approached the north side of the house, where he'd found the narrow seam in the clapboard siding. In daylight, the line was easier to spot. Faint but unmistakable, a slightly different pattern among the wooden slats, as though they had been installed at a different time than the rest of the exterior. He pressed along the seam. The boards flexed slightly, revealing a hollow space behind them. With a pry bar and steady pressure, he loosened a section of the siding until it came free with a groan, releasing a breath of cold, stale air. Inside was darkness, a narrow cavity descending into shadow. The smell that drifted out was faintly metallic, touched with the dusty scent of long-abandoned space. He reached inward with the lantern and revealed a narrow passage, barely wide enough to crawl into. The walls were lined with old beams, older than the house itself. Older than the plaster. This was part of the previous structure, untouched for decades. Or perhaps not untouched. The wood bore scratches. Not random marks. Repeated, purposeful strokes. Lines etched into the timber with something sharp. Some were grouped in sets of 5, others isolated, as though someone had been marking time without rhythm or reason. His wife called out from the doorway, "Please don't go in alone." But he knew he had to. Something had reached out from inside this space. Something had left objects for them to find. Something that had spoken his name. If he didn't uncover the truth, it would keep reaching farther into their lives. He climbed into the narrow opening, lantern held ahead of him, and crawled. The passageway descended slightly. Dust coated the floorboards, cobwebs brushed his face. The air grew colder and denser, as though he were moving deeper into a forgotten lung of the house. After several feet, the passage widened enough for him to crouch. The interim room. He knew it even before he saw it. The space opened into a small chamber, 8 feet by 8 feet, shaped irregularly by the angles of the roofline and the later construction wrapped around it. The walls were bare wood, old and darkened with age. The ceiling slanted sharply. A single tiny window boarded from the outside allowed a thin sliver of light to filter in, illuminating motes of dust swirling in the air. But the room was not empty. In one corner stood a small stool. In another, a pile of old rotting fabric, and in the center of the room lay a wooden board, flattened, scorched, and covered in hundreds of tally marks. Each mark was carved deeply, some cutting into the grain so forcefully the wood had splintered. He knelt beside it. The tally marks ran in near-perfect rows, tens, hundreds, more. Enough to represent years, maybe decades, of someone marking time. But there was something stranger still. At the bottom of the board, in a section where the tally marks had begun to crowd together, someone had carved a name. His name. Not once, but multiple times. Layered over previous carvings, scratched out, rewritten. Each version shakier than the last. He felt a cold tightening in his chest. He reached into his pocket and removed the note found in the wall. The handwriting matched, not perfectly, but close enough. The strokes had the same flawed curve, the same pressured lines, the same desperation. As he stared down at the board, the lantern flickered, and from somewhere behind the interior wall, just beyond his reach, came a soft shuffle of movement. Slow, deliberate. He turned. The hairs on his arms rose. Someone was on the other side of the timber, standing in the hidden space between the interim room and the sealed attic. Breathing, waiting. "I know you're there," he whispered, voice barely audible. The movement stopped. Silence pressed against him like a physical force. Then a tap, one single tap, directly behind his head. He staggered to his feet, heart pounding. The message was unmistakable. The thing trapped in the walls had been here long before the Wilkins family arrived. But it hadn't begun marking tally marks or carving names until the father moved into the house. It had recognized him, or believed it recognized him, and now it wanted acknowledgement. When he crawled back through the passage, lantern shaking, he found his wife waiting at the opening, pale and terrified. She looked past him into the darkness. "What did you find?" He swallowed hard. "A room. And?" He hesitated. "And someone has been in it." Her hand covered her mouth again. "Recently?" "No," he whispered. But they were very close. The storm clouds gathered again overhead. The wind picked up, rattling the clapboards. As they sealed the opening with boards and nails, the father knew something with certainty. The thing in the walls was not going to stop. Because after months of subtle sounds, marks, and messages, it had done something new, something more deliberate than anything before. It had left him a trail. And trails only lead one direction, inward. That night, after sealing the exterior opening, the father could no longer pretend that the house was reacting randomly or that the sounds and signs were coincidences. The interim room proved something the family had feared, but never fully articulated. The house held histories layered like sediment, and something buried within those layers had reached upward toward him specifically. Once the children were asleep, he told his wife everything he had held back for weeks. Not every detail, but enough to open the door of silence between them. He spoke of someone from his past, someone he had once known closely, someone whose life had unraveled in ways he could never bring himself to fully examine. This person had gone missing years before, in the aftermath of a bitter winter that had driven both men to desperation. Nobody had ever been found. Rumors had spread in hushed tones through his hometown. Some said the man had fled. Others whispered darker possibilities. But the father had always suspected that the truth was more complicated, bound up in guilt and circumstance. When he finished speaking, his wife stared at him with a hollow expression. "Why didn't you tell me before we moved here?" she whispered. He had no answer. Perhaps he had wanted to believe the past could be exiled, that silence could be a form of mercy. But the house, with its hidden rooms and decades-old scars, had other ideas. It had found a way to summon the past into the present, and it was no longer content with whispers. Around midnight, as the parents sat in the dim glow of a lantern, a soft vibration moved through the floorboards, a tremor running beneath the house like a passing breath. The mother froze. The father gripped the arm of his chair. Then came the tapping again, no longer delicate. This time it was an insistent, rhythmic 5 taps, in quick succession, then a pause, then 5 taps again. The tally marks, the counting, the message was unmistakable. "It wants you to follow," his wife whispered. He shook his head. "I don't know that," but he did. The tapping moved across the ceiling, traveling from the sealed attic door to the far corner of the house, then downward, following the line of beams toward the ground floor. The sound traveled like footsteps passing overhead, then descending inside the walls. It stopped near the parlor where the children slept. The father lunged for the door, pulling it open so abruptly the lantern nearly toppled. The children were still asleep, curled together in blankets. But something had been in the room with them. He knew it instantly. The air carried a metallic tang. And on the wooden floor, against the far wall, lay a second splinter of wood, this one larger, darker, and carved with 10 tally marks instead of 5. Double. He felt sick. Whatever was counting was drawing closer in a way that mirrored time's own progression, accelerating with pressure building. He snatched the splinter and stuffed it into his pocket beside the first. Nothing good waited for 12 or 15 or 20. Whatever was carving these marks was not marking its own time, it was marking his. The next morning, he sought out the archivist again. She received him with a wary expression, as though she had spent the previous night thinking about the interim room as well. When he showed her the tally-mark splinter, she went pale. "This," she said, "isn't from your house." He stared at her. "What do you mean?" She lifted the wood carefully. Different grain. Older. Not from any structure built in this region in the last 50 years. She disappeared into the archive stacks, returning with an old map rolled tightly and secured with twine. She unfurled it across her desk, revealing the layout of the previous property that had burned decades before the Wilkins family ever lived there. The old map showed a different structure, a smaller house with an outbuilding attached, and a long, narrow annex. "What was this?" he asked. "A workhouse, according to what little documentation survived," she said. "Used for repairs, storage, and occasionally to house someone who needed to be kept apart from the main family." He felt the air thicken around him. "Someone?" The archivist hesitated. "An unstable relative," she said softly. "Records suggest he stayed, or was kept, in the annex for years. After he disappeared, the family refused to discuss it. Shortly afterward, the structure burned." She traced her finger across the annex walls. "This wood," she added, holding the splinter, "matches the material used in this part of the old building." The father felt his pulse pounding. "But that building is gone." "Most of it," she corrected. "But parts of old structures are often built into new ones, especially when families want to save on lumber." Tears stung the corners of his eyes, not from sorrow alone, but from a dawning horror. If the annex walls had been reused, if beams from the old confinement room had been incorporated into his attic, then the thing in his walls was not just tied to him. It was tied to the land, the wood, and the architecture itself. An inheritance of secrets passed through construction like a curse. When he returned home, the sky darkened with another approaching storm. His wife met him at the door, shaking. "Something happened," she whispered. He followed her into the house. At the base of the stairs lay a trail of small, circular scatterings of plastered dust leading upward. Step by step, he climbed slowly, heart hammering. At the top of the stairs, he saw what had terrified his wife. The crack in the wall was now a fissure, a long vertical tear that exposed the dark cavity inside. And pressed through the opening, sticking out into the hallway like a gesture frozen in mid-motion, was a hand, not flesh, not bone, but a hand carved from wood, weathered, blackened, and carved with 20 tally marks along the wrist, as though whoever or whatever was trapped in the walls had crafted an effigy, a representation, a message. His wife sobbed, backing away. The father approached slowly, lantern trembling in his grasp. The wooden hand was pointing downward, not at him, not at the children's rooms, but toward the floorboards beneath his feet, toward the lower level of the house. The cellar, the one place the family had never feared, the one place no sound had ever come from, until now. As he stood there, frozen, a faint tapping rose from below, slow, heavy, patient. It was calling him. And whatever waited in the cellar was no longer content to stay trapped in the walls. In the months that followed the discovery beneath the Wilkins attic of the journals, the ledgers, the testimonials, and the final unsigned note, the county would quietly close its file, noting that no prosecutable party remained alive and that any further inquiry would serve only to agitate old wounds. Yet closure, as the record itself makes painfully clear, was never the purpose of this story. Even the last investigator assigned to the case in the early 1960s, an aging clerk named Ellery Tate, who'd taken it upon himself to organize the surviving documents, concluded in a marginal note that closure is a luxury the facts do not support. For the Wilkins family, the house, and the land beneath it, the truth was a burden no one seemed eager to carry into the future. In those years, the Wilkins house stood largely untouched. Renovations were discussed, but never completed. Prospective buyers visited with interest, only to withdraw days later, often without explanation. Real estate agents blamed the remoteness of the property or the rising cost of upkeep for older structures, but their tone carried a kind of hesitancy, as if articulating the real reason might risk bringing something to the surface that ought to remain undisturbed. The attic remained locked. The door, reinforced after the 1960 collapse, bore the marks of fresh carpentry layered atop older, more frantic attempts to secure it. Those who ventured into the upper floor in the early 60s described a heaviness in the air, a stillness not shared by the rest of the house. Light bulbs burned out more quickly there. Dust collected in ways that defied simple neglect, forming strange circular patterns in the corners, like the remnants of something having once been placed there, removed, and placed again. It was during this period that a local historian, a man who preferred his name to remain absent from any official retelling, gained special permission to review the Wilkins boxes stored at the county archive. His notes, which survive in partial form through photocopies shared decades later, describe an unease that deepened as he pieced together the scattered chronology. "The human mind," he wrote, "is remarkably adept at stitching together narratives, even when the facts resist coherence. But this case refuses to be stitched. It frays at the edges. Every time you think you understand what happened, another thread unravels." He became particularly fixated on the final journal entry attributed to the occupant of the attic room. In that entry, dated late autumn 1874, the handwriting becomes jagged, and the ink is blotched in places where the pen appears to have trembled. The writer mentions hearing footsteps outside the door, followed by the turning of a key and the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "He says it will be better," the entry reads. "He says I must not worry. The darkness is only temporary." Then one line stands alone at the bottom of the page, barely legible. I hear the house breathing. This line troubled the historian more than anything else. I have encountered metaphor in diaries of hardship, he wrote in his private notes, but rarely a metaphor so consistent across sources. Multiple witnesses, decades apart, describing the house as possessing intention, rhythm, and even appetite. He was careful not to suggest anything supernatural. His training forbade it. But he admitted that the repeated descriptions of the house as an active participant in the events of 1874, rather than a mere setting, demanded consideration. The architecture itself, he wrote, seems complicit. In 1964, the historian attempted to contact surviving members of the Wilkins family but found few willing to speak. One elderly granddaughter living in Tennessee agreed to a brief conversation by mail. Her letter, still preserved in the historian's papers, contains a paragraph that has been cited repeatedly by later researchers. "My parents never discussed the attic," she wrote. "But whenever storms came through, my mother would check the ceiling in the upstairs hallway and place a rug beneath it. She said the roof swelled in heavy weather, that it remembered too much." Asked to elaborate, she declined. "Some things," she concluded, "are best left to the past," and yet the past did not remain quiet. In 1971, when the property changed ownership for the first time since the 1940s, the new buyer hired a construction crew to reinforce the upper beams and assess lingering structural issues caused by the collapse 11 years earlier. The crew chief later claimed that while his men were clearing debris near the chimney column, they uncovered a hollow behind one of the internal supports. Inside was a small tin container wrapped in oilcloth. The container held a handful of folded pages, unfiled and unsigned, but unmistakably written in the same hand as the earlier journal entries discovered in the attic. These pages, dated several weeks later than the last entry found in 1960, should not have existed. The attic had been sealed before that date. The writer, according to the known timeline, should no longer have been capable of producing them. The pages contain no confession, no revelation, and no neat summary. They instead read like the thoughts of someone trying desperately to mark time in a place where time had lost meaning. "I count the hours," one line reads, "but they do not stay counted." Another, "Some nights I dream I am outside, standing in the yard, looking up at this very window. I see myself inside, writing these words. I cannot tell which version is real." Perhaps the most disturbing line in the set reads simply, "They will not leave. They are part of the beams now." The construction crew, unsettled by the find, turned the pages over to the county archive, where they were quietly cataloged but never publicized. The historian, now elderly, reviewed them once before retiring. In his final note, written in a trembling hand, he echoed the last line of the original journal, "The house breathes." By the mid-1970s, efforts to modernize the property stalled. Contractors complained of inexplicable measurement angles that shifted slightly from week to week, boards that warped faster than the climate should allow, and nails that refused to grip properly in the attic beams. Some blamed moisture. Others blamed the age of the structure. None were willing to express aloud what many quietly suspected, that the house resisted alteration, that something in its bones remained unwilling to forget what had occurred within its walls. In the late months of 1978, the property was finally sold to a couple from another state, unaware of its history. They renovated the lower floors, repainted the exterior, and replaced the flooring. But they left the attic untouched. Not out of fear, they insisted, but practicality. The cost of restoring it exceeded their budget, and besides, they had no use for the space. Yet neighbors would later recall that the attic window, dark for decades, would sometimes appear faintly lit in the deep hours of the night. A glow too soft to be electric, too warm to be a reflection, a glow like a lamp shielded by a hand. No official records describe disturbances under the new owners. They lived quiet lives, rarely speaking of the house, except in passing. But one visitor, a distant cousin, who stayed with them over a stormy weekend, wrote afterward that she slept poorly due to a rhythmic sound overhead, steady like breathing, but not quite human. She admitted the sound might have been the wind, but she added that the cadence seemed too patient for weather. And so the story settles into the present, intertwined with the land, the timbers, and the memories pressed into the walls. Some say the attic is merely an architectural oddity, the product of a restless builder and a tragic family history. Others say the house absorbed what it witnessed, absorbed it so deeply that its structure cannot release it. Whether the Wilkins family locked the attic door out of fear, guilt, reverence, or exhaustion remains unknown. But the door stayed locked for decades, long after those responsible were gone. If you ever find yourself near a house like this, an old structure whose beams seem to shift with the weather, whose windows reflect more than light, and whose upper floors hold a quiet that feels almost watchful pauses for a moment, listen, not for ghosts or visions, but for the stories houses are built to contain. Some are harmless, some are warnings, and some, like the one sealed behind the Wilkins attic door in 1874, remind us that the past does not always stay where we leave it. If this journey through forgotten records, hidden rooms, and the long memory of old houses has stayed with you, consider subscribing. These stories endure because they're told and because someone is willing to listen.